Good day, and thank you for joining us on Black Agenda Report. I'm Margaret Kimberly. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Today we're joined by Austin Cole. He's one of three co-coordinators of the Black Alliance for Peace. The Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations called on the international community to boycott the 2026 World Cup, which was recently held in the United States. Now that the World Cup is over, we will discuss the boycott, its purpose, and whether its goals were met. No pun intended with the word goal. Hi, Austin. How are you?
Hey Margaret, I'm doing well. Good to be here with you.
Yeah, we spoke before the World Cup started, right before it began. Now it's a memory. So talk to us about the call for a boycott itself, why Black Alliance for Peace felt it was necessary. Let's start there.
Yeah, the call for a boycott was necessary first and foremost because of the U.S. hosting the World Cup, right? The U.S. obviously hosted alongside Mexico and Canada, but was the primary host as well for the majority of the games, including the final, right? And so it was necessary because of the U.S.'s impunity, its violence, complicity in genocide, attacks on other sovereign nations, in particular, even attacks we saw during the World Cup, but even before, obviously, against Iran, against Venezuela, the continued strangulation and attacks on Cuba, as well as broader, violence and impunity, both internationally and then also domestically here in the U.S. And that kind of brings me to the second piece, which is that the U.S. is a dangerous place, right, for both its people who are residents here, people who are citizens, as well as folks who are visiting or folks who don't have legal status. And so for us, it was, ridiculous to suggest that the U.S. could be a faithful host of the World Cup while engaging in such, violent acts and such repression, both domestically and globally. And so that's really where the call for the boycott came from, to call for the international community to boycott the World Cup, as well as for folks who are, within the borders of the U.S. to boycott and to agitate against it as well.
And there was a coalition, oh God, I'm getting the name wrong, Anti-fascist Football Coalition.
Yeah.
I got it right.
No,
Okay.
you got it right.
Okay, tell us about that.
Yeah, so the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition really emerged towards the end of last year when this call for a boycott started first as a call to move the games, right? To move the games from the U.S. Obviously, that wasn't that call was not answered, right, or was not followed through with by FIFA and by the organizers. And so the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition was a group of over 36 organizations, both international, as well as many in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and then others from throughout the globe. Both local organizations, national orgs, international organizations, many at various different levels, right? And so those organizations really came together to mobilize against the World Cup, right, and also to mobilize towards especially at a local level, different forms of engagement with football, what folks in the U.S. primarily call soccer, and other ways to engage in that from a people-centered perspective, right? So I know maybe we'll talk about this a little bit. There were a lot of folks hosted People's World Cups or People's football tournaments or games or individual events or things like that as well, and are actually continuing to do those things too. But this coalition really came together to oppose, as the name sounds, right, fascism, right, and to oppose the neo-fascism of the U.S., of the Zionist entity, the genocide that they're committing in Palestine, the broader militarization and military attacks, against Iran, against other countries, and to really focus on not even initially not a boycott, right? Initially sort of agitating against the World Cup in the U.S., but when it became clear that was going to take place in the U.S., right, that they were going to move forward with the games, BAP, called for a boycott, and the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition unanimously actually agreed and signed on to that boycott as well. And so that became the call, to boycott the World Cup and to boycott the U.S. as a broader extension of that.
And before the World Cup began, we saw all the reasons why the U.S. was not an appropriate host nation, officials being denied entry to the country, teams, players not being admitted to the country. But the worst treatment was meted out to Iran. Talk to us about how the Iranian team was treated and how that makes the case for the U.S. Not being an appropriate host for any international events.
Yeah, this was, exactly what we expected to happen, right? And exactly why we called for the boycott of the U.S. as a host of the World Cup. And thank you for mentioning as well, to be clear, we're calling for the U.S. to not host any international sporting events, right? As well as Israel, the Zionist entity, there to not host or to be able to participate in any international sporting competitions or events. And we knew this was going to happen because the U.S. had signaled that they were going to do this, that they were going to treat Iran terribly, right? That they had already denied the Iranian delegation for the trophy ceremony, right, and for the selection process, denied them entry into the U.S. And they actually tried to get FIFA to replace Iran, and actually tried to get Italy, because Italy was sort of the last European country out, and obviously is a big football country as well, and has a lot of connection to the U.S. And it was reported, at least, that Italy refused actually to do that for the integrity of the sport, right? Because they didn't actually qualify. And so the U.S. was reluctantly forced to allow Iran to play in the World Cup, but they would not allow them to stay in the U.S. All of their games were in the U.S., and they wouldn't allow them to be switched to a different group. FIFA wouldn't switch them to a different group so that they could play in Mexico, right? So instead, Iran had to stay in Tijuana and fly to the U.S. And, I think it was covered pretty well in their first game, where they actually had to leave that same night after their first game. And so they had to, thinking about, as, professional athletes playing for your country on the world's biggest stage, you're having to hop on a flight, go to the airport, hop on a flight for several hours to go play your game. And then instead of being able to, rest, allow allow that lactic acid to sort of flow out of your muscles, right? Ice up, eat in the right way, you have to get back on a plane, travel across another country, go through customs, and then get back before you can put your feet up and rest, right? And so Iran had to do that the whole tournament in their 3 games. And those games were lost, or tied closely, and also were, full of sort of controversy in those games as well. And so on top of all the injustice that you already mentioned, Margaret, and that we've already talked about from a geopolitical level and a moral level, right? There was also a violation of the integrity of the game too, when it comes to Iran. And there was plenty of other things that happened over the course of the time as well that, we probably won't have time to get into today, but folks, I'm sure anybody that's been paying attention has seen that, right? And so what we really want to drive home is that these two things are not disconnected, right? It's not just happenstance that all of these various, injustices on the pitch happened in the U.S. during this FIFA World Cup, right? It is because of the broader geopolitical sense, right? I saw today that Trump says he wants to recommend Infantino, the head of FIFA, for UN Secretary General, right? And I mean, Trump, says a lot of stuff, right? But it's clear that this sort of relationship that they've developed is working for Infantino. He's getting out of it what he wants, right? He's getting sort of money, recognition. He's on Trump's good side. FIFA can probably depend on Trump to do a bunch of, to support them in whatever they have planned, right? They're supporting the Gaza Board of Peace and that whole continuing genocidal process. And so all of that impacts the game as well too, because all of those incentives, we already know FIFA is corrupt and has been corrupt, but at least what some people have joked is that Sepp Blatter, the former head of FIFA, he was corrupt, but at least he loved soccer, right? At least he loved football, right? Whereas Infantino really just seems to be out for power as well, aligned to be a tool, a white supremacist capitalist colonial tool for U.S. imperialism and broader pan-European capitalist patriarchy, right? So I think that is really, it's really essential that people look at how the games actually transpired and understand that as part of the broader infrastructure and why the U.S. should not and cannot host future international sporting events under the Trump administration, but broadly when the U.S. as a U.S. imperialist regime. Right, whether or not Trump is in office or not, right? Those incentives are going to continue to happen. And as we think about other sporting events happening soon, we know that is going to impact the integrity of the game because it's already happening in many other areas as well. And so just that kind of really clear, like we really want folks to be clear about that and to speak about that because, football fans have been really frustrated by the way that the games turned out actually, right, on the pitch themselves, right? There's been a lot of talk about that, but not as much necessary talk about the connection between why that is.
This sort of corruption with Trump began last year when Trump asked for and received a new FIFA Peace Prize that had never existed before. And Gianni Infantino presented this new prize to him. But Trump's personal intervention didn't stop there. A U.S. player got a red card, which is a serious penalty, and he should have been banned from the next round, from the next game. But Trump called Infantino and asked them to undo the red card. And so he played. And the irony is this player is a birthright citizen of the U.S. That is to say, he didn't grow. He was only born here, had no other connection with the U.S., but is a U.S. citizen. That's the sort of thing Trump usually rails against, but not this time. And there were lots of other controversies as well. So this sport called the beautiful game, loved by millions of people all over the world, is compromised by this entity which sets the rules for how it's played internationally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And like, we've talked about before, last time I was on, and many people have said, right, FIFA is absolutely a corrupt institution, right? Most of these international sporting bodies, right, governing bodies, right, are as well. Capitalism and corruption go hand in hand, right? So we understand that, like, we're not expecting everything, to be perfect in that sense or acting like it wasn't before, but it is the forces that are corrupting those areas, right? There is a much heavier hand on FIFA as a tool, right? As a racist and colonial tool, that it was enforced in a way that has not been done before in this World Cup, right? And we can only expect that to continue more in the future, both in FIFA as well as in other sporting events that the U.S. is going to host. So this is really just an indication of that, right? It's not that FIFA is uniquely this way. Now, the World Cup is probably the most watched, sporting event in the world, and maybe the most cherished as well by the most number of people, right? And so it's major in that sense, right? But it's not unique in those dynamics. But I think what you said, Margaret, is that Trump, say what you will about Trump, but he or his team or his people, he comes out of TV. He's a branding person, right? He saw an opportunity and he took full advantage of that opportunity of the U.S. hosting the World Cup to push every lever that he could, right? Now, he couldn't actually make the U.S. win that game where they got demolished by Belgium. Belgium played horribly the whole tournament, played so mediocre the whole tournament with their team of like much older players, but they came out against the U.S. and blasted the tops off of them. So thankfully that couldn't continue moving forward, and Trump had to go a different way with the way that they were trying to build in the propaganda, but of the U.S. propaganda. But I think that it's really clear from the play on the field, as well as even many folks have talked as well about like the halftime show that they had in the final, which I didn't watch any of the games, but I obviously keep up with what's going on and hear from other people and read about it. And that game they had I think a big like love banner, and they had all these kids and talking about love in the world, and and the connection of humanity, while they are bombing water utility in Iran, depriving people of water, over 10,000 people of access to water in Iran, clearly targeting civilian infrastructure. At the same time that they are preaching, love, sports washing, all of these things through the World Cup. So you can't say that it wasn't effective, but that is also the reason why boycotting was such why we called for such a forceful mechanism as boycotting, and said, we really have to understand that while this is a beautiful game, while this is something that connects people, it is fundamentally a game, right? It is, fundamentally a cultural expression that cannot be put above the lives of any people, but in particularly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, in fact, who are dying or at risk because of U.S. imperialism and U.S. impunity.
And even worse, the U.S. is hosting the next Olympic Games, the Summer Olympics in 2028 in Los Angeles. The Trump administration will, regardless of what happens that November, Donald Trump will still be president, and the same team of people will be in charge during the Olympics. And the World Cup has given us a preview of how they will behave during the Olympics. So it's it's like a double trauma for the world, for the U.S. These two sporting events that are watched by millions of people are both going to be hosted by the U.S. while it is accelerating its effort to extend fascist control over other countries.
Absolutely. And I mean, even more so maybe than the World Cup, we know that the Olympics have been utilized time and time again by, fascist countries, right? By other countries to launder their reputations, right? We know that even the last World Cup in the Olympics, the last Olympics in Los Angeles in 1984 were boycotted by many countries, right, including the Soviet Union and others, because, obviously because the U.S. was hosting them. But it is really taken to another level, and when we know it's going to be taken to another level, the Olympics, anywhere they're being hosted, they are hosted in a single city, right? And so we know that LA is undergoing massive changes, right, because of these Olympics. There are many organizations that are part of the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition, as well as part of other groups like No Olympics LA, that have been already moving for several years, ever since it was announced, right, ever since it was actually even an idea, right, that the Olympics were going to be hosted in the US, right, and there's opportunity for that to happen. So we know that this is coming, even probably more so than the World Cup, because the Olympics has so many different sports. There are so many other qualifying activities that go into the Olympics, right? So I think last time I was here, maybe I mentioned this, Margaret, which I'll just say today I'm wearing my Cuba baseball jersey from the Olympics, from the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, Omar Linares jersey, numero 10, when Cuba won the gold medal in baseball, in pelota. And and we already know from the World Baseball Classic taking place earlier this year, which Venezuela actually beat the U.S. in the World Baseball Classic earlier this year, that there were a lot of complications with the Cuban team, right, in the process, because the games were being hosted in various different places, right? But some of them were being hosted in Puerto Rico, some of them in Miami, right? And in certain areas. And there's been a lot of difficulties in that. And also the Pan American Games and other qualifying events that lead up to the Olympics, where Cuban athletes have not been able to travel to Puerto Rico, right? Even though Puerto Rico, is in a weird situation because it's part of the U.S., right? It's a colony of the U.S., but it's also in the Caribbean, so they participate in a lot of the Caribbean events. But if something is being hosted in Puerto Rico, you need a visa to travel there, right? A visa to the U.S. And so that's complicated. And we know with the State Department's attacks on Cuba, the Trump and Rubio's attacks on Cuba, that it is certain that they are going to do their best to reduce or try to stop as well the Cuban delegations from being able to participate. And again, the Olympics is even more difficult because many of the events that happen in the Olympics are happening over the course of many several days. It's not like a single game where you can move, one day and then you go somewhere else the next day. They're happening, a lot of them, over the course of like 2 weeks for just one event sometimes, right? And so, and the whole Olympics, we know, takes place over a long period of time too. And so that is, again, a really, from the integrity of sport, you can tell them probably that I'm someone who cares a lot about sports, would care a lot about, the actual competition and people being able to engage in that, and athletes being able to compete, as well as the countries being able to celebrate their cultures, being able to come together and to, see kind of like the beauty of human beings meeting one another and competing against one another in that way. But we know that is all sort of that fantasy, that really is a fantasy, right? Because that's not what actually happens when a country like the U.S. that is systematically attacking, destroying livelihoods, murdering people in these countries, when they're doing that, and then they are supposedly hosting this game that is supposed to bring out the best in humanity. So we know that's going to happen with the Olympics. We know that in some ways it's even more insidious because, like I'm saying, a lot of those qualifying events have already been happening and will happen over the next couple of years in the lead up. And it's a lot of small things that will create a situation where many delegations or athletes may not be able to compete, right? And so they may be reducing. And we know Cuba leads among Latin American nations in medal count. Cuba's athletic program is historic, particularly for an island of 11 million people. And so stopping them from being able to be on the largest stage, right? Stopping them from being able to represent their countries is part of silencing those nations, right? Is part of denying the human dignity of those peoples and nations and erasing their struggles and most importantly, erasing the U.S.'s crimes against their people. Because if we don't see them on the TV, if they're not reported on, then people forget that those things are happening, right? And they're left to suffer in silence. So I think this is all part of a very strategic move by not just the Trump administration, but broadly by U.S. empire that has been going on for a long time around controlling sports, controlling the narrative of this really important cultural aspect. What has just changed is that with the Trump administration's focus on more heavy-handed and really repressive and genocidal forms of attack, is that their dealing with sports also takes that character, as opposed to maybe the Obama administration or other more liberal administrations where it has sort of been a little bit more carrot than stick, right? A little bit more, hey, if you do this, we'll give you some funding so you can develop sports in your country, right? If you go along with us. And so they are very much doing that, whereas the Trump administration, again, is more on the heavy-handedness of bombing people or starving people into submission.
Yes, and it's important to talk about Cuba and this siege by the U.S., depriving Cuba of fuel, which means they are deprived of electricity, which means there's a whole host of things you cannot do if you don't have electricity. You can't preserve food. You can't schedule surgeries. You can't preserve some medicines. If there's no fuel, How do you have people say, oh, there's no garbage collection? Well, how can you have garbage collection if there's no fuel for garbage trucks? I mean, I could go on, and it is, frankly, it meets the definition of a genocide. But I also want to talk about the hypocrisy of other Western nations, the European nations, and the Biden administration pushed to ban Russia from the Olympic Games because of Ukraine. But the U.S. has, a war of aggression against Iran, wars of aggression, the genocide in Gaza. The United States gets to participate in everything. And whatever you want to say about Russia's actions in Ukraine, if the U.S. can participate, if Israel can participate internationally in sports, well, then they certainly should be able to. But we see this hypocrisy by the Western nation. And I want to say, Russia hosted the World Cup, I think 8 years ago, and suspended their usual visa requirements to make sure that everyone involved got to travel. Isn't that interesting?
Absolutely. And and that's pretty typical, right, of host nations where they make accommodations. So, when you heard Gianni Infantino talk about, well, a country needs to stay safe, et cetera, right? I mean, you can't talk about, and that was in reference to the Somali referee who was supposed to come and be here in the U.S. You can't talk about, the state surveillance infrastructure and all these things that are used to monitor anybody that comes here, right? And realistically say that letting in a referee to referee, football matches for the World Cup is actually a threat to national security, right? Because that's what every host nation does, right? Every host nation makes those accommodations so that everyone can participate in the games, right? So as you said, Russia did that as well during the 2018 World Cup. And it's very normal, right, that would happen as well with the Olympics as well, to make sure. And that's part of why they have these federations, right, to do these things for each of the sports. And, you're exactly right? Nobody here is trying to, I think what needs to be said as well is, like, we are actually not really asking these institutions to be the more morality police, right, to be the most ethical institutions in the world. We're actually asking them just to abide by their own standards that they've applied in previous tournaments and in their general hosting of sporting events, right? And so, as you said, if they're going to ban Russia, right, which Russia has been banned from, the World Cup, from UEFA, and that, the European management of football, they've been banned, from the International Olympic Committee, and so the athletes can participate as individual athletes, right? But they can't represent their nation. Why can that not happen with the U.S. when the U.S. is doing far more, right, to destabilize the globe, is responsible for killing far more people, right, and grievous human rights violations, right? Even the kind of the most liberal and kind of milquetoast organizations agree to that as well, right? And so I think that hypocrisy speaks a lot of volumes to the cowardice of these other federations, of these other nations, right? I believe the Norwegian Football Federation is the only European one that has really been, publicly driving a call to ban Israel from, sporting event and to refuse to play. Now, some other teams have refused to play them, and others, particularly outside of Europe. But that is part of the that is part of what enables Trump's strategy, right? Is the deep cowardice and lack of really any integrity in every venue, right? In every forum. It's not just sports. It's also the UN, right? It's also these regional organizations, right? Everyone has bowed down basically to Trump. And so they've allowed themselves to be completely bulldozed over, or they've decided to jump on for the ride and be part of it, right? And that's like Trinidad and Tobago in the Americas, right? In the role that they've decided to take, right? To say, like, actually, we're just going to hitch our wagon to Trump. And so that I think is really critical in terms of understanding how this has happened and how this continues to happen and how it will possibly happen with the Olympics and with other sporting events if other federations of other countries refuse to say anything. And I think what we would say really is how far will you allow this to go, right? How much will you allow your integrity to be compromised, right? So that you can, and turn a blind eye to genocide, turn a blind eye to, wars of aggression, asymmetric wars of aggression, attacking civilian infrastructure, the starvation of entire nations, right? The double speak that justifies that starvation and that genocide that could easily be turned on any of these other peoples or nations if they are out of line. So I think really while this, starts and we see it in sports, it reflects a broader trend more generally of global governance, or I should say lack thereof of global governance, and the allowing of basically a might makes right decision. And I think coming back to sports, we can only hope, last time when the US thought that Cuba would fall after the fall of the Soviet Union and the special period, the Cuban baseball team won the next 2 Olympic gold medals in 1992. And then the last time the US hosted the Olympics in 1996 in Atlanta, Cuba won back-to-back gold medals at the same time that the US was trying to assure the downfall of the nation and of the Cuban Revolution, and assured that, they were a people that were going to fail and that there was no way they could survive this. So I think, we could all of us as individuals, as groups, as movements, and also as nations, really take some cues and take some learnings and inspiration from the Cuban people, who have been so strong in their integrity and in their commitment to sovereignty and to social justice, that not only have they survived, right, but they have also on the world stage time and time again in athletics, in medicine, in rescue efforts, right, and in education, in all of these different areas, have shown that if it is possible actually to be sovereign and to be in solidarity with the most oppressed people in the world, and to really show what it means to be in solidarity with all of humanity, and not to need to dominate or destroy or to commit grievous acts, of violence against other peoples or other nations in order to have your own human dignity, safety, and security. So I think if other nations were to take up that mantle, were to take up that mentality as we enter into the Olympics and as we enter into all these other sporting events and broader things that will be happening over the next couple of years, then maybe we could come together and really face this neo-fascist onslaught by the U.S.
And as we close, tell folks how they can find out about the work of Black Alliance for Peace.
Absolutely. So we check us out at blackallianceforpeace.com on socials, as well as Blacks for Peace on Twitter. Black Alliance for Peace is on Instagram and other platforms, YouTube too. And we have several newsletters, right? We just had a newsletter on a bulletin on domestic militarization that came out about a week and a half ago. We have several newsletters that come out related to Asia and the Pacific, related to Africa, bulletin on AFRICOM Watch Bulletin, and a bunch of other information, both domestically here in the U.S. and more broadly globally. And our North-South project for people-centered human rights, which is the one that drives forward our work related to the World Cup, related to people-centered human rights in sport. In this case, can be found at peoplecenteredhumanrights.com. And people should check that out and can find some of the connection to the Anti-Fascist Football Coalition there for anybody that wants to join. So this is not over. This struggle continues and actually is only ramping up. So really encourage folks to join, to keep up to date, and to join the resistance, locally and internationally in these ways, and to coordinate with us and others who are taking up that fight.
Well, thank you so much, Austin Cole of the Black Alliance for Peace, for discussing the mobilization and call to boycott the World Cup. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.